right, welcome everybody. Just going to quickly share. All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Ben Zuloff. I'm the board president of the Reading League Illinois. We really have a great evening planned for you tonight, and I know we're all excited to dive in. So I just want to give you a quick overview of the night, give you a few updates of what's going on with the Reading League Illinois, and then hand things over to Dr. Heel. So tonight we're using a webinar format, which means your audio and video are disabled, but you can still put questions and comments in the Q&A, which will just be seen by the speakers, or in the chat, which will be seen by everybody. Please feel free to type questions in either place, and we'll monitor and do our best to get as many of those answered during the Q&A at the end. We'll be sending out a recording to everyone who registered within 48 hours. I'm sorry, to our members who registered within 48 hours. As the evening progresses and any resources or links that are shared, we'll collect those and include them in the email with the recording. And then finally, if you're interested in getting a certificate of attendance for CEUs and or Illinois PD hours through ISB, we'll post a link to register for those at the end of the webinar. Oop, should have been there. So just a little bit about us. The Reading League Illinois was founded in 2021 as the 19th state chapter of the Reading League, which is a national education nonprofit led by educators and reading experts dedicated to promoting knowledge and accelerating the global movement towards reading instruction rooted in science. As a state chapter, our all-volunteer board is currently made up of about 9 people from around the state. Actually, that's down to 8, who are passionate about improving literacy instruction in Illinois. We come to this work from a variety of perspectives: teachers, parents, instructional leaders, curriculum coaches, and dyslexia specialists. Picking up in November, and Blake at Harvard continuing the conversation excuse me, in January. In February and March, we'll focus on writing with Joan Sedita and Natalie Wexler, and we'll wrap up the year discussing academic vocabulary with Sean Morrissey in April, and the knowledge acquisition framework with Dr. K. Rajakumar in May. I'm so thrilled we can provide you with that full schedule tonight. Now, for our members, we have a new coffee chat format this year. These discussions will continue the conversation from that month's webinar as each guest will recommend a short article to read that helps us bridge research to practice. Our first coffee chat will take place next Saturday, and I'm really looking forward to developing our learning community with you. I hope you'll be able to join us. Now, to keep up with this, please consider becoming a member. It costs as little as $25 to join, and benefits include our monthly coffee chat series, grants and scholarship opportunities, discounted conference rates for the Reading League Illinois conference, and just the good feeling for doing your part for literacy. For a little bit more money, you can receive free Illinois PD hours, and then we absolutely do rely on membership dues, so please don't hesitate to join us or make a donation. Okay, let's get started. I am super excited to introduce Dr. Jim Heel. He is a leading advocate for bridging the worlds of research and practice in education. His work seeks to develop expertise in evidence-informed instruction and leadership in K-12 schools, school districts, and higher education around the world. Dr. Heel was a high school English teacher and a principal for over a decade in the UK. Thanks for muting that, Lindy. Before moving to the US, where he became a director of practice at Harvard's Research Schools International Initiative. In his work at Deans for Impact, a US-based nonprofit, he strived to increase teacher effectiveness by infusing learning science principles into educator preparation. Jim currently serves as professor of evidence-informed education leadership at Academia University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam, teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he earned his doctorate in educational leadership, and is co-founder of Learning Science Partners. He is author of 3 books on the science of learning, which are How Teaching Happens, Mental Models, and Instructional Illusions. Without any more ado, here's Dr. Jim Heel. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Ben, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. So delighted to be a part of this. I've long admired the work of the Reading League, as I just put my slideshow together here. As I say, I've long admired the work of the Reading League, and I think that any organizational structure that strives to improve education at the local level by building educators who are passionate about moving learning forward for students and children and communities is certainly dear to my heart. So I appreciate, Ben, for your leadership on this work, and the volunteers that you mentioned that lean into this work, and obviously very grateful to all of you for giving at least part of your Thursday evening to listen to me drone on. So hopefully I can give you your time's worth here today. So as my title suggests, I'm going to be exploring mental models, schema, and how we make meaning. And I'm going to do that through an understanding of the science of learning. In terms of a quick sense of an agenda, we're going to start really by asking ourselves the question, what even is a mental model? And in part, we will use the distinction between a mental model and schema as a way of delineating the difference. And then I'm going to dig into two principles or mental models themselves. One is the manner in which we can use non-examples to support student learning, and the other is the question of prior knowledge activation, and how do we draw on the existing knowledge and expertise of our learners. And so I'll start with this question of what do we mean by a mental model in the first place. Now, one of the ways that I've often gone about talking about this is that mental models exist everywhere. It doesn't matter if you are doing something relatively simple like making a ham sandwich, right the way up to something deeply complex with many moving parts like an advanced piece on the piano. Mental models are part of how we make sense of the world, and indeed they are part of the way that we interact with the world and achieve our aims and our objectives. One of the ways that I've seen examples of this in the world when it's done to a very high level is with this gentleman. Sure you will recognize. And as an Englishman, I reserve the right to use football-based examples. And this is one. There was an interesting study done into Lionel Messi, in particular, the work that he does on the pitch to do what we call scanning. Scanning in the game of football is any occasion where you sort of pivot your head to take a picture of what's going on around you. And so in a typical match with an average footballer, most of the time, the number of scans that a player would make is around about 100 to 115, in that kind of range. Messi, when he was recorded in the World Cup just gone, and they counted the number of scans that he did in a game, it was 680. And part of what is happening here is that in any given game of football, Messi, by scanning the field around him, he is building a picture in his mind of the environment that he's in, the way that he intends to interact with that environment, and what it would mean to succeed within that environment. And so mental models are really things that can be developed in real time, as is suggested by the kind of scanning and sense making of what's going on around a person, but they can also happen over time. And so part of what's quite fascinating to me about mental models, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is that I think we all have mental models of what good teaching looks like. The question is, how nuanced, how sophisticated, how precise is that mental model? And what would it look like to refine it and sharpen it and make it even more effective for our purposes? So started to give you a sense of what I mean by a mental model, but I'm going to dig a little deeper, and I'm going to do that by differentiating between a mental model and schema. Now, many of you may have encountered the term schema before, and it relates to the manner in which we organize information in our minds. So one way of describing this is to think about the difference between a novice and an expert. So in the case of a novice, schema is more like a shopping list. We see items of knowledge mostly in singularities, or at the very least within kind of very small points of connection. And so it feels more like a list, a shopping list of sorts. When we become more expert in something, the manner in which we organize information feels less like a list and more like a family tree. In other words, the items that we interact with and the ways in which experts organize those items is by relationship to one another, and relates to a way in which we can build networks of ideas rather than seeing ideas in a linear fashion. And so one of the ways that we talk about this is to say that expert schema is organized as an interconnected network of ideas. As a result, what schema enables us to do is to be able to achieve a greater level of conceptual understanding of the world around us. So for instance, let's think about this in terms of if you were cooking a meal and following a recipe book. If you had very advanced schema and you were reading the different ingredients involved, you might see that there is a certain type of onion or a certain type of vegetable or a certain type of spice. And your schema would be able to situate those different components within their categories and within other categories. I know what this spice is because I can relate it to all the other spices that are either similar or different to it. And it could be the same for any item of knowledge. In other words, schemas provide us with conceptual understanding. By contrast, mental models provide us with procedural guidance. Now let's use that same metaphor of cooking. This is instead of having an understanding of the parts of the process and whatever ingredients are involved, mental models are a bit like saying, I'm going to taste as I go. I'm going to say to myself, oh, that requires more salt, or oh, that needs to have the heat turned down, because you have a mental model of what you want the meal to end up tasting like. And so the decisions that you make along the way, both small and large, are not just about knowing, as a schema would be, but rather about doing and achieving an ultimate goal. And when we become very good at things, mental models, our mental models, become more sophisticated. And as such, when you will become a world-renowned chef, you would have a very rich and specific and granular sense of saying to oneself, I know what this dish needs to taste like. I know what's going to get me there. And even if things have to be adjusted and tweaked and kind of shaped along the way, I know how to do that because I have a sense of where I want to end up. Now, I hope you can see that this is something that I found eminently important for teaching, because teaching, if it is anything, is a series of almost innumerable small decisions that teachers have to make every day. And as a result, you cannot simply rely on what you're coming to know from moment to moment, nor can you always rely on what you've already learned, because the scenario is so fluid and chaotic and can move from one sort of direction to another at a moment's notice. So the only way to keep up with that level of intricacy and chaos, frankly, is to have a mental model of saying, no, I know what good teaching looks like, or I know how this particular component of teaching helps support learners. And I use that as my North Star, so that when things do veer off the track or there's opportunities for things to kind of go awry, I still have that model in my mind of where I want to get to and how I might get there. And in sum, and this is just to set our baseline for what we mean by these terms, I would argue that mental models allow us to do a number of things, and I'll give you a moment to read these as I go. Okay, so as you can see, some of these overlap with schema. Having high schema means you can notice patterns, as the third bullet point suggests. Having higher schema does allow you to make sense of things, as the second bullet point would suggest. But the mental model kind of goes beyond that, in my opinion. It is about seeing more so that you can do more. It's about being able to make moment-to-moment decisions. And then it is all, and this is perhaps one of the most important distinctions, it's in service of a desired goal that you already have a rich understanding of. One of my mentors used to say to me, very good teachers, fantastic teachers, great teachers, they know what to do even when they don't know what to do. And part of what I think that kind of aphorism relies on is this idea of mental models as a guiding or navigational force for us when we are engaging in complex processes. So that's kind of set the terms for what we mean when we talk about a mental model. But nevertheless, it's better for me to show you what such a mental model could look like. So I'm going to start with this mental model that relates to using non-examples, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote that kind of helps us to ground ourselves here. So you'll see on the screen some eggs that appear to have just been boiled. I remember many years ago when my brother first went to university, and he phoned home, you know, the customary phone call back to mum and dad saying, you know, I need this and I need that, and I don't know how to do laundry and I don't know how to do that. And this particular phone call was about the fact that he was trying to boil an egg. And so he called my mother and he said, Mum, I'm trying to boil this egg. I've been doing it for 10 or 15 minutes and nothing's happening. Every time I try to crack the egg, it's gotten no closer to being boiled. To which my mother replied, somewhat sort of awestruck with whether or not he'd actually done this. She said, "Did you put any water in the pan?" To which there was a silence on the other end of the phone, and she knew what had happened. And so what my brother had done in that moment was inadvertently come up with a non-example of how to do something. By having first thought that you can cook an egg without water, he was able to never forget that you indeed do need it to be successful in that task. So one of the ways that we can think about non-examples is to say, you end up being able to understand what something is by being able to appreciate what it isn't. And that is a very powerful way to invite learners to consider ideas with more nuance and more intentionality. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which a model such as non-examples help. So one of the ways in which they can help learning is that they do what cognitive scientists refer to as making concept boundaries bright. What we mean by concept boundaries is to say, if there is a right way of doing something, what is the sweet spot for that thing, and what would be the edges of that idea or that concept or that activity, so that if you exceeded outside, you would begin to miss the. In other words, where does that focal point of what it means to understand something exist? It's pretty good, pretty easy examples to illustrate what this means. Let's just say you were teaching someone to use a hammer. You might start by saying, well, when it comes to placing your hand on the handle, if you hold it too high, then it is likely that you will lose power. If you hold it too low, it is likely that you will lose control. And as a result, there is a sweet spot in the middle that is the likeliest place where holding the hammer would need to be done if you were able to engage in that activity effectively. Notice how in this case, too high on the handle and too low on the handle are, in this instance, the boundaries of the concept. And by saying what those places are, in that they are those wrong places to hold it, by definition, we are setting the terms of where might be the right place to this case engage in this act of using a hammer. So they're great at setting these boundaries, and they're great at allowing us to be able to cue learners into the specific components of what we want them to think about. They do something else to assist learning, which is to say that they help us to limit incorrect assumptions about ideas. Now, these incorrect assumptions can often be described as conversion errors in the literature. So a classic conversion error would be all squares are rectangles, so it must be the case that all rectangles are squares. So this is an attempt to understand the features and characteristics of something, but assuming or conflating that these ideas are one and the same, or that they obey to the same rules of geometry, when in fact they do not. So a classic question that you can ask is, say something like, well, hang on, this isn't a square, it doesn't have 4 equal sides. And so in this instance, you're almost throwing the concept back at the student, at the learner, and saying, well, this has 4 equal sides, but has 4 sides, but they're not equal. So is that an example, or is that a non-example of a square? And at this moment, there's no real way to answer that question without cueing into the characteristic features of what makes a rectangle, and indeed what makes a square a square. Here's another example of what it looks like. Sometimes you can give something that's even further a departure. You could show a square and say, why is this a triangle? Or is this a triangle, why or why not? Further still, and this is a great study called the Almost Triangles study, in which kindergarten students were shown triangles like this that were almost triangles. Why? Because the corners around it. In order for a triangle to be truly a triangle, it needs vertices. It needs points at which the sides converge. And so when kindergartners were asked, is this a triangle, why or why not? Not only were they able to answer that generally speaking, it does look like a triangle. However, those rounded corners mean that it cannot truly be one because we know that triangles include vertices. In other words, the manner in which that question was being asked was tuning in and honing in and cueing in learners into the precise part of the concept that the educator wanted them to engage in. And so this is where we can turn to the first of our mental models. In this instance, we try to present and offer up mental models that are a sticky and memorable way to remember the concept. And this one is red light, green light. So with anything that relates to red light, green light, we might start with an example, the red light, and then we offer a contrasting example, the green light, or vice versa. So let's imagine you're doing an elementary English ELA class, and you wanted to communicate the idea that the suffix ed shows that something happened in the past. So you might start by offering an example. She showed me how to use the remote weeks ago. Here the ed of show indicates that it is in the past, and therefore the grammar of the sentence makes sense. And yet, without a non-example, we're leaving to chance whether or not learners are in fact cueing in to the right components. So the non-example might say, yesterday I walk to the store. And we could easily ask a group of learners, what's wrong here? Or do you need to alter about this in order for it to move closer to the example that I've already shared? You could then start to open up the case of the question, not just in terms of filling in the gaps of ED where it is required, but instead asking more and more open-ended questions. So you show a non-example and you say, well, why doesn't this sentence make sense? Show me the way in which it either obeys or disobeys the rule of, in this case, the past tense of simple verbs. Then you can offer, you can mix this up. You could then say, here is another non-example. And then this is almost like moving it to the sort of more to the top of the pile. What would need to change about this sentence in order for it to be grammatically correct in the past tense? But wait, there's more. You can take it further still. You could take a whole concept like mammals. You could introduce a series of mammalian features. You know, mammals have hair, they lactate, they're warm-blooded, and so on and so on and so on. And so a non-example question would be to say, why isn't a fish a mammal? In fact, what would have to change about a fish if it were to be classified as a mammal? Again, the push here is to say, I want you to show me what this thing is by understanding what it isn't. Because when we learn something new, that is one of the key ways in which we can properly delineate the contours of an idea. So that's one mental model. And remember, these are all ideas whereby the concept itself is grounded here in this metaphor of a traffic light and of red light, green light, but that model itself is designed to make this principle and this way of thinking about non-examples stickier and easier for teachers to employ. So let's turn on to another one. This is the second of the mental models for this evening, and that is this idea of prior knowledge activation. Now, one of the ways I normally start exploring the idea of prior knowledge is with a seemingly simple, deep statement, which is that we make sense of the world via our existing understanding of it. And this might seem like the most sort of intuitive thing to consider, so much that it doesn't even warrant kind of scrutiny. But if you think about it, each of us wakes up afresh each day, not as if we've been born completely new and without any idea of the world. You know how to brush your teeth, you know how to drive a car, you know how to make a ham sandwich, you know how to play the piano, because you have long-term memory, which are the things that you've successfully committed through careful encoding and regular retrieval. And you can pull those things into your working memory in the form of a model that says this is what it means to do this thing. And so if we were going to think about that in schematic terms, so I talked earlier about schema as different from mental models, we could imagine something like this playing out. Starting on the left-hand side, I sense something in the world. I realize that it is a four-legged creature with two pointy ears and it says woof. And then I go into my long-term memory. I gather the information that I need from an interconnected network of ideas that we know to be schema, like that family tree that we talked about. And then you get to say, well, it's not as cat-like as a cat, and it's not as bear-like as a bear, and unicorns don't exist, and balloon animals aren't alive. So the doggiest looking thing I'm looking at right now is a dog, and that means that you can respond or react accordingly. Furthermore, if your schema of what makes a dog included that when you were 7 years old you got bitten by one and have been scared of them ever since, well, then your schema is going to be telling you things about how to make sense of what you are seeing. And so on the right-hand side, you see that kind of networks of nodes and rods. That is a figurative representation of, again, what we mean by schema. We organize things in relationship to one another, and as we become more expert, those relationships become more sophisticated and more far-reaching. Now let's look at what that would look like when it comes to a mental model. In this instance, remember, you're not just activating schema in terms of interconnected networks of ideas, you're activating everything that you've come to know about something in terms of a model that provides a direction of travel towards a successful outcome. So let's imagine that your car is broken down, you realize that the tire is flat. You have a sense of what it would mean to fix that problem because your mental model is saying to you, okay, I need to start by getting the jack out of the trunk. I need to use it in this way. I shouldn't take off the anything else until I've removed the hubcaps. I then know how to remove the tire and replace the new one, and so on and so on and so on. The process is guided not so much by information alone or interconnected networks of ideas alone, but rather by a North Star conception of saying, I know what I want to achieve, and I can build a mental model in my mind, and I have done over time, for what it would mean to do this task and achieve those goals. So when we think about prior knowledge itself, there are a few ways in which it can actually hinder learning. One of the ways that prior knowledge is something we have to be very careful of is that not all prior knowledge is created equal, and sometimes it can either be inaccurate or irrelevant to the way that we think about things. So I tend to describe this as saying faulty understanding can give rise to or beget future faulty understanding. So we have to be really careful about making sure that the prior knowledge that we activate in learners is as accurate and relevant to the learning as possible. And these examples of these kind of misconstruencies exist everywhere. So I've got an example from my own life. My daughter, Nora, who is 5 now, but I think at the time she was maybe 3.5 or 4 years old, was completely earnest in the belief that a big toe was called a foot thumb. And no matter how much I tried to convince her otherwise, her schema of what that part of your body was indeed a foot thumb. And I think to this day she's still not in a position to fully give up on that belief. Another example was when I was reading a picture book with my daughter Nora. Maybe she was about the same age actually. And she pointed at a picture of a helicopter and she said, "Look, Daddy, an aeroplane." Now, in this instance, as a 3 or 4 year old, it's not the end of the world that she made that conflation. Are they both forms of transport? Yes. Do they man-made? Yes. Do they fly in the sky? Yes. But we know that there are distinct differences between a helicopter and an aeroplane. And in order to know more, you need to know better. And then you need to be able to conceptually relate the two. Now, let's imagine for a moment that my daughter Nora is 25 years into the future and she has become a nautical engineer, well, she's going to know everything that makes an aeroplane and everything that makes a helicopter. At least we can hope she would, because otherwise I don't think I would want to be a passenger in an aircraft that was designed by someone who still got the two confused. And so, as we become more sophisticated in our understanding of things, we absolutely need to be clear that any faulty prior knowledge, if left unattended to, is going to compound on itself over time. And therefore, mental models for what it looks like to arrest that and nip it in the bud are really, really important. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are ways in which the activating of prior knowledge actually helps learning, and that is when it makes us better at solving problems. Now, some people, I'm sure it's none of us. I'm in fact I'm certain of it. But I've heard a lot of people talk about the power and the priority of critical thinking as something that every student should learn to do. And I don't have any problem with that. I think that that's an absolutely important aspiration. But when I hear people talk about critical thinking, oftentimes I hear them talk about it as an end unto itself. In other words, you can teach critical thinking as a discrete skill. And I'm here to tell you that you cannot think critically about nothing. It would be like trying to bake bread without dough. You need to be able to have knowledge items in your mind, and you need to be able to connect them in meaningful ways, and you need to have mental models that help you consider, I've seen something like this before, and I know what it would mean to solve it. Otherwise, you do not have any dots to connect. And so part of what's really powerful is that very thoughtful and psychological studies have been conducted to show that this is real and that the stakes are pretty high when it comes to what it means if we ignore these things at our peril. So I'll give you an example of such a study, and I'll give you a chance to interact. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a riddle, and I want you to work out what you think the answer to the riddle might be. And then I'm going to show you some data, and I'm going to get you to think about that data in relation to this riddle. So first things first, here's a riddle, and I would like you to think about what the answer to this riddle might be. Okay, so hopefully you've read it. Hopefully you're having some ideas as to how you might answer it. I've had a whole flurry of different ways in which people have answered this before, actually, just so you know. Some people have said, I heard the other day when I did this experiment, well, just don't go in the cave, which I thought was a very pragmatic answer, but we have to assume that the person has gone into the cave. Now, some of you, I hope, if you're good at riddles, may be thinking some version of take some sand or some pebbles from the beach and leave a trail of them as the man walks into the cave so that they can retrace his steps to get back out of the cave. Now, that is the closest thing to the right answer, but here's the data. This gets very interesting. When researchers ask this question of students in different parts of the world, the students from the United States, on roughly 75% of them got it correct. And students from China, roughly 25% of them got it correct. Now, if we are to assume that US students are not, generally speaking, quote, smarter than Chinese students, there's got to be something else going on here. And the reason has something to do with our childhoods here in the US. In the United States, a common fairy tale that is written to children and read to children at bedtime is Hansel and Gretel. In this instance, it was those US students' prior knowledge and ability to form a mental model of what it would mean to answer that riddle correctly that allowed them to make critical sense of the riddle. It wasn't they had better problem skills than the It's that they had the core knowledge that they needed to have a fair shake at answering and getting the riddle right. How do we know that this is true? Well, we know that this is true that because when the researchers changed the edition and they changed the fairy tale at the heart of the riddle to something else that was recognized within the Chinese culture, the phenomenon reversed. In that new condition, 75% of Chinese students got it correct and only 25% of US students got it correct. Why? Because the riddle was instead framed around a Chinese fairy tale from which those learners could draw. And so it really is a case that when it comes to prior learning and prior knowledge activation, it takes one to know one. And we need to be able to acknowledge that as a model unto itself when we think about student learning. There's another way in which prior knowledge can help learning. In fact, it's a powerful way that we may understand in relation to another aspect of learning science. Prior knowledge helps learning because it can alleviate cognitive load. One of the ways that we might exemplify this is this old classic. I'm sure we've all been in a science classroom down the years in which we were invited to label the parts of a flower. Now, there are two ways that a teacher could go about inviting students to do this. One would be to say, I need you to find the name of each of these, and I want you to label them correctly. So in this instance, it is the student's job to do the naming and labeling of the parts and to think about what it would mean for those parts to interrelate to one another. Now imagine if you're having to think about the parts of a flower while simultaneously trying to think about what all those parts do, then that is going to severely limit your cognitive bandwidth and it will limit your capability to make those connections. This is what cognitive scientists call high element interactivity. On the other hand, let's say that teacher provided the learners with the parts of the flowers and the names thereof, and then invited them to think about the manner in which they worked together within the organism of the plant or the flower, then those connections would be much more likely to occur because there would be enough cognitive bandwidth to make those connections. And this is referred to as low element interactivity. So if we were to ask a question such as, what are the names of each parts of this flower? High element interactivity, high demand on cognitive bandwidth, because people are having to both recall and apply their understanding in one step. Instead, if you said how do plants use petals, stamens, stigmas, and so on to survive, we are providing the means by which students can dig into the kinds of questions that we want them to consider. After all, students are going to expend cognitive bandwidth. The question is, what are they going to expend it on, and how can we ensure they're expending it on the things that we want them to? And so as you can see, building prior knowledge is a little like building a puzzle. You add new pieces, which is new information, to an existing and evolving picture of the world. And if those pieces and places have somewhere to live and somewhere to stick, then those ideas are much more likely to be assimilated into our understanding of what we are doing or seeing. But of course, as I've named, just because we're building a puzzle in our minds or a picture in our minds of what it means to understand something, that doesn't mean that that encoding is always necessarily done robustly and well. So again, students will encode and they will draw from prior knowledge whether we like it or not. We need to ensure that that prior knowledge is being activated and built with coherence and with fidelity to the ideas that we want our learners to engage. Going right the way back to the beginning about my ham sandwich example, and I said that that was very simple. Well, even something as seemingly simple as making a ham sandwich can go awry if we don't have the necessary prior knowledge to appreciate what actually is required. So, let's imagine you said, okay, making a ham sandwich is easy. Take one piece of bread, put the ham in the middle, then take another piece of bread and put that on top. It could be conceivable, although I think you'd probably have to be like my brother with his misboiling of eggs to be this misguided. But even seemingly simple things where we thought we taught it, we thought we gave the instructions, and we had every belief that students had enough prior knowledge to be able to do what we were asking them to do, can still be misconstrued and still lead to actions, activities, outcomes that we as the teacher really had not considered. So now let's turn to another mental model. So we had our red light, green light earlier as a way to kind of ground this concept and know how to do it well. And now when it comes to prior knowledge activation, I'm going to draw on the mental model, the rock climber. Now, in any rock climbing situation, and I will admit that I'm not a rock climber, so apologies if I have any misconstrues here, and in fact that my prior knowledge might not be up to scratch. But my general understanding is that you need to find footholds and you need to find handholds, and that is the way that you navigate and scale up the rock face. Well, one way we might think about this is to say that prior knowledge is our foothold. It's what we already know about things that propel us towards new understanding of those things. By extension, the new knowledge that we are seeking is the handhold. When prior knowledge propels us in that direction, we can reach for that new information and envelop it and incorporate it into what we already know. And one of the great things about this is that for the most part, when you start climbing up a rock face, the things that used to be handholds become footholds. So new knowledge in one scenario grows up to become old knowledge that you can rely on, and so on and so on and so on. And part of the teacher's job is to ensure that the students bridge that gap and that they bridge it with fidelity. Again, we don't want any corruption of the concept by being loose or abstract in the way in which those two places, prior knowledge and new knowledge, are brought together. And so here's a simple step-by-step process for doing just that. You could start, and I believe should start, at the end, which is to say, where do I want my students to end up? What is that handhold to which I want them to propel? The second step would be to say, well, where are they starting from? What is that foothold? What is the knowledge that they already possess, or indeed the knowledge that I may have to build in order to give them the means by which to propel to new understanding? And the third step would then be to say, how am I going to get them from one place to the other? So I'll break each of these in turn and give you a sense of what it might look like within a specific classroom example. So let's start by saying, question one within this step, what precisely is the information I want students to take from this experience? I underline precisely because if we as educators make the terms of the learning and the objectives of the learning loose, then the learning that results will be loose and vague and more abstract than if we are ultra precise about what it is that we want learners to learn. So in this example, let's imagine another elementary example to keep things simple. Say you're teaching the basic principles of division for the first time. The core concept thereof is that you want students to understand that division is the equal distribution of a quantity. That's it. If they walk out of class that day with that information in their back pocket, that is you having done them right by that stretch of learning within that particular lesson. So what you want to be able to say to yourself is, if that's where I want them to go, where are they starting? And how can I use where they are right now to propel them to where I want them to be? And in this case, we might ask ourselves, well, what can I reliably say my students already know that is relevant to the concept at hand? Here I've underlined the word reliably because this cannot go on just assumption and general beliefs about learning. If you are not sure what your learners already know about something, then make sure. If you are not sure whether that information is relevant or irrelevant or somewhere in between, then make it so. This can come from any number of arenas within a classroom, from exit tickets to reviewing of previous work to inviting students to hold up mini whiteboards to offering turn and talk opportunities so that you can circulate the room and get a sense of the level of understanding. you can and should and do take in all of that data. The question then becomes, how can you use that to approximate where students are at and how they might use what they know? In this case, let's go back to our core concept. You want students to understand that division is the distribution of a quantity, and you could reliably say, in this example at least, that your students already know how to play games that involve dealing cards. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this means that your students are running some kind of clandestine poker game at the back of the classroom. We're assuming that it's Uno or some version thereof. But you know that such a game has been featured in their learning before or in a classroom activity. And so you know that they know how to do that. You know that they know how to deal cards to a group of people. Well, now we have our third step, how you're going to get them from knowing something that's relevant to matching that to what you want them to understand. And here's a very important question you can ask them and ask yourself. How can I invite my students to see that these concepts share the same underlying structure, even though they might appear different on the surface? Of course, playing cards is not the same as division, but underneath the hood, it is the same as division. It doesn't matter so much whether or not the surface features are the same. It's that the core concept that each is reliant upon is the same. And this is where I often find lazy metaphors come to the fore, and we need to be really careful about not using them. You know, learning is like riding a bike, or such and such is like such and such. Well, it's not. Not when you peel away the layers of the onion. You have to be able to peel away those layers and see that the inherent concept is in fact shared. And so again, we could say that the sharing of cards is it has the ability to be represented in numerical terms. You could invite learners to share cards. You could invite them to jot down how many cards there were, how many players there were, and what that would say about the distribution, and so on and so on and so forth. And then you get to have some fun with it and move the furniture around. You get to say, okay, that's good start. Well, now what would happen if I change the total number of cards? How many would players receive in that instance? Or what about if I change the number of players? How many cards would they each receive in that instance? And again, through the manipulative of the cards and understanding that they already have a level of fluency and automaticity and an understanding at their fingertips of what it means to distribute something evenly, now you can start to get under the hood of what division actually means. You're using prior understanding of something to link to new appreciation and understanding of a new concept. And so the way that I would sum this up is to say, instead of asking yourself, are my students picking up what I'm putting down? You can instead ask yourself, what do my students already know that will enable them to pick up what I'm putting down? So I have shared with you just two of the mental models today, and yet the book that has recently been released and is now out in the world has a whole host of mental models, and each chapter is dedicated to one of these models, and within each model is a principle of learning science that is encapsulated and exemplified and bottom lined so that educators can hold them and use them rather than them being kind of abstract theoretical concepts. The models themselves are a way that I've used the science of learning, hopefully, to teach the science of learning. And that would be my hope for any educator who hopes to infuse these principles into their day-to-day practice. So if you do want to learn more, that's what the book looks like, and there's a QR code that could take you to a place where you could lay your hands on it if you have been sufficiently interested by what I've shared today. I think now I'm in a position, Ben, if it's all right with you, to segue into some questions and answers. And I believe that you were collecting some along the way. If anyone had questions in the chat, or if they wanted to bring them to the fore now, feel free to drop them into the chat, and Ben can act as curator of questions here.
Well, before that, I'll do a shameless plug that I get nothing in return from. Anybody who's still with us, Mental Models, I had the email Jim as soon as I had finished reading it earlier this year. Fantastic book and very quick read. So is the one that he didn't mention, but I did of Instructional Illusions. So definitely recommend those. We have several questions, so I'll try to get through as many as we can here.
Mhm.
One that was texted to me that I thought is pertinent as we have this conversation of discovery learning versus explicit instruction, novices and learners. It says, going back to the egg cooking without water, that sounded a bit like discovery learning. Wonder what the difference is with non-examples.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in fact, we can use non-examples and prior knowledge both to answer this question. So, the idea that whenever you are attempting to do anything, as I said earlier, the notion of knowing what it is enables us to better understand what it is. Um, at the heart of that, of course, it is its opposite, which is what we might describe as discovery learning. If we are not either given the guidance of a non-example that would enable us to delineate the boundaries of an idea or arrive at its kind of contours, its outline, where it begins and ends, and where something else begins and ends. And if we're not able to accurately and precisely activate the prior knowledge of learners, well, what do they have left to do? What they have left to do is to rely on their wiles and their sort of ability to kind of persevere, hacking away through the undergrowth until eventually maybe they stumble on something that is meaningful and useful. The non-example of that, and this is from the work of John Sweller, is what he calls means end analysis, which is this: we make a guess, we check if we're right, we make another guess, we check if we're right, and so on and so on and so on. That's different than inviting students and supporting them by establishing the contours and boundaries of something so that it doesn't become this sort of wild goose chase of discovery learning.
Love that. So helping them establish and not having them establish it on their own.
Correct.
All right. I'm just trying to take them in order here. Another one that came in was, you had said at the start with mental models is establishing like, I know what this looks like. And
Mm.
teaching, if we're trying to shift to more evidence-based practices, we may not know exactly what that looks like in practice. And so
Mhm.
when we're implementing it in the classroom, we may not know what that looks like. So I guess what would be your suggestion for teachers and how to best develop those new practices before taking them into the classroom?
Yeah, this is great. I think there are a few phases that have to be true if any school or school system is moving towards a better appreciation of what it means to engage in a new way of thinking. One of the ways that I often describe the science of learning is that it's like a lens through which you see your practice differently. It's not just some initiative that you have to kind of attach on to what you already do. So for me at least, whether it's within a school environment or an entire district environment, there needs to be a level of buy-in that says, no, we wish to explore these ideas and we think they're powerful and we think they're important. Upon exploring those ideas, and this is a big part of what I do in the day to day, it seems to me inevitable that you need to be able to render those ideas within instructional contexts. So you'll very rarely find an example of me sharing an idea, a concept of the mind, without pairing it with something that says, well, this is what it looks like in the classroom. Now, I'm not saying that teachers who are new to these concepts are going to be in a position where they can do that straight away. But if they're paired with mentors or professional learning leads like yourselves that give of their time to set up these kinds of learning opportunities, my push would be move closer and closer and closer to say to yourself, this is what it looks like in my condition, this is what it looks like in my context, or this is what it doesn't look like. You may discover that there's a certain aspect of what you do that is already a quote non-example. And so what does it mean to sort of say, oh, well, if I know it isn't that, now I kind of have a better sense of what it is. So again, it's a slow and iterative process, but part of what we mean when we talk about models and mental models when it comes to things like this is, can you see it manifest in the wild? Could you watch a lesson or have a part of your own lesson recorded and watch it back and then think about a principle such as without getting too meta, well, what was your use of non-examples like in that lesson segment? To what extent did you adhere to the sort of principles of that? And in what ways and on what occasions could you have sort of gone about that differently? So it's got to live and breathe within the day-to-day of the work.
I like that. Sounds like coaching would help with that too.
I think it probably would, and that coaching would help with understanding the science of learning, and the science of learning sure as heck gets helped by very good coaching.
Awesome. So we have a few examples with cognitive load and not examples. So one is, well, they kind of go together. What about circumstances where non-examples stick in the minds of students and lead to misconceptions that last?
Well, and this is where the non-examples kind of bridge with that with the prior knowledge stuff, right? You'll remember that I showed that image of the puzzle, completed puzzle, but all the pieces were in the wrong place. The figuratively at least, that is what it looks like when students have been allowed. I'm just going to say that allowed by their teachers to have misconceptions persist over time. One of the challenges of this, of course, is inevitable about the way that schools are organized, which is that students move from grade to grade to grade, and it is often when your students arrive into your grade, you relatively quickly, if you know where to look, get a sense of what kind of learning has been taking place in that subject prior to their arrival in your classroom. And so, to the extent that we have agency and control, you need to be able to have an appreciation of where the existing understanding lies, even to be able to anticipate the kinds of misconceptions where, I've taught this 5 times now and my learners always trip up on X. And to have strategies in your back pocket to say, when I encounter those kinds of misconceptions, whether I predicted them or not, I have an idea or ideas of what I would do to correct and refine those misconceptions. But know this, if they are left untouched and unaffected, they will persist. And worse than that, the knowledge that you build on top of that will be even as faulty as the thing that it was built upon. It would be like building a house on sand. So being ultra specific and inviting learners to be ultra explicit about what they know is the only way to guard against that kind of corruption that will only lead to ineffective learning over time.
So I'm going to jump ahead here because this question directly relates with what you're just saying. I think the use of the word allowed there is very powerful. So I guess would you be willing to talk about the concept of productive struggle? And is it appropriate at some points in the learning trajectory, or is it an instructional illusion?
Mm. Nice. See what we did there. I've always had a bit of struggle with the phrase productive struggle. Um, um, Most of what I've read about productive struggle would suggest that the emphasis is on the struggle insofar as to say if you're if you're if you're coming up against stuck points or you're having to like dig through and meet a resistance with perseverance, then you must be learning. And I'm not sure that that fully encapsulates what effective learning ought to look like. Um, there's two concepts that I think much better and more adequately attend to this. One is effortful thinking, which is to say, learning ought to be difficult, but it needs to be taxing in exactly the ways that are aligned with the learning itself. It can't just be a generic appreciation of struggle. It's that the cognitive lift and the cognitive requirements are clear and they don't overwhelm the learner. They don't exceed cognitive capacity. Because then, what kind of struggle is that? It's more meaningless struggle or futile struggle. The other would be from the work of Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, which is the notion of desirable difficulty. If something is going to be difficult for a learner, it has to be that it is made difficult in the right ways, not just struggle for its own sake, but rather you have a precise idea of those moments where that learning is going to feel taxing, but you know that it's going to be because you want it to be, and you can be extremely precise about when those instances are likely to occur.
Awesome. We do have more questions, but I also want to be very cognizant of your time, especially being out east. It's an hour later for you.
Don't worry,
Um,
I missed out on some screaming children in a bath, so this is infinitely better than that. So yeah, but no, I really appreciate it, and I will say before you wrap us up that if questions are there that people want to reach out to me and ask me, perhaps Ben, you could circulate a contact email for me, and always more than happy to keep these conversations going and share and compare ideas as necessary.
awesome. Well, I can collect the questions and send them to you, and then obviously no rush, but when we get them, we can get them back out to our registrants. Does that work for you? Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap things up because I also want to be cognizant of all of your time here with us tonight. Let me go back to this. All right. So, um, I can't tell you, this has been such an informative night. It's very encouraging and inspiring. So thank you very much, Jim, for sharing your wisdom and your expertise tonight or with us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's webinar, again, please consider joining the Reading League Illinois as a member or renewing your membership so that you can stay abreast of the upcoming events. And please come to our coffee chats. Again, I'm really looking forward to building a community of learners starting next Saturday morning. If you haven't already received the text that Jim had shared with us, all members should be receiving that soon. Um, for those of you interested in joining, this QR code will take you directly to our registration page. That you can also follow this bit.ly for those of us who'd rather join online. And then finally, for those of you who would like to earn CEUs or Illinois PD hours for tonight's event, here's the link that you can use to take you to the PD form or the QR code. Both will take you to the same place. To verify that you attended the full webinar, the form will ask you to enter a secret phrase, which is mental model. I don't know if you want to take a second to write that down or take a picture of it. Once we get that from you, a PDF certificate will be emailed to you for your CEUs. For Illinois PD hours, we'll email you the evaluation form for ISB, and you'll need to fill that out and return it to us. As we wrap up, thank you again, Jim, for sharing your time and knowledge with us this evening. This was amazing. Audience members, thank you for being here and for showing up for the students in your care and for your commitment to helping every child learn to read. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.